Yeah, so I think we'll get started now here. So I think we have lots of familiar faces from people who've been to previous sessions this year. But I'm going to do a quick introduction before I pass it over to Cindy. I also want to say happy Nowruz, Persian New Year, and happy spring to everyone. It's become spring since the last time we met. So this is the third and final part of the 2021 Small Farm Sessions. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Georgia and I coordinate SPEC's Farmland Ecosystem Services project. I started doing that in September. These are the 8th annual Small Farm Sessions and they're organized by SPEC. This year we have support from KPU, UBC Community Engagement, Vancouver Foundation, Patagonia in partnership with Make Way Foundation, and Kwantlen Polytechnic University. And this morning we're talking about how to bring degraded soils back to life with Cindy Prescott. I will introduce Cindy in just a moment, but before I go further, I do want to let folks know that the session is being recorded. So if you have any concerns about that, you can send me an email. I'm going to put my email into the chat right now. Yeah, you should be able to see it. And as we've done in previous sessions, I also want to acknowledge that I am an uninvited guest on the unceded territory of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples in what's now called Vancouver. I really like this quote from the Indigenous Food Systems Network. Indigenous food systems include all of the land, soil, water, and air, as well as culturally important plant, fungi, and animal species that have sustained Indigenous peoples over thousands of years of participating in the natural world. And yeah, so I just want us to keep in our minds that most of the lands that are farmed in BC are unceded Indigenous lands and have been part of Indigenous food systems for thousands and thousands of years. And lastly, as you know, this series is a project of SPEC. We're a charity that was founded in 1969, and we develop practical solutions for urban sustainability. We're very volunteer driven and do work in the areas of education, research, and advocacy on food, energy, transportation, waste, and climate change. In my time working at SPEC so far, it's been a really lovely, welcoming community. And so I would encourage you to approach us if you're interested in volunteering or collaborating or donating your time in any way. And also wanted to mention before we end this last session that if you are, if at any time in the season or the next little while, something comes to your mind that you think would be really useful to learn about that would fit in with this project focusing on farmland and ecosystem services, please let me know. And I would be happy to try and organize something. So yes, and now I'm going to introduce Cindy. I was really fortunate to be able to take a class with Cindy at UBC last year on ecological restoration. So Cindy is a professor in the Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences. She's a forest ecologist who studies ecosystem processes such as litter decomposition, organic matter formation, and nutrient cycling. And she currently teaches ecological restoration, agroforestry, and scientific writing. So welcome, Cindy, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks, Georgia, and thanks very much for the invitation to be here. It's nice to be part of this group now, since I made a little shift in my research and thinking to move a little more into agriculture, which I'm kind of a newbie at, but I've been thinking and and reading a lot about it since finding out more about soil degradation and soil regeneration, which is what I'll be talking with you about today. Is my screen showing?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Volume okay?
Volume's good for me, but others chime up too if it's not. Sounds good to me.
So this is the topic that I'm going to be talking about. As I said, I've become more and more familiar with this. I started working on this problem mostly to do with reclamation of mine sites and logging roads. And then more recently, as I found out more and more about it, I have shifted into thinking about it in many contexts, including forest landscape restoration and also agriculture, and how we could modify our activities to reverse this process. So this is a global problem that you'll all know about. Some consequences of soil degradation are obvious in many places. Some of the worst was in China. They've been acting to reverse this, but it's still a problem. We heard just a couple of weeks ago about terrible sandstorms they're having. And this is related to the degradation, severe degradation of soil west of the major city of Beijing. And this results in these sandstorms and also silting up of the rivers following erosion. And then that results in flooding. So that's some of the worst. This is just from my hotel window in Nanchang back in the days when we traveled. And you can see this massive river, but just a massive amount of soil being carried off out to sea. You can see it just by looking on Google Earth or Google Maps. Here's the UK, and you can see over on the left the drainage of the Severn, I think it is, just filled with sediment, and lots around London as well. You don't have to look very hard to see this is just happening everywhere. All this soil just being eroded into the ocean. And in the last few years, Australia's been having their own Dust Bowl, and some frightening scenes coming out of there. And now a lot of this is due to drought, but the point is that in many ways, many complex ways, drought is exacerbated by degraded soils that can't hold water anymore. And so they become dehydrated and they blow away or they wash away. And much of this degradation is due to agriculture and the way we are doing it. And this is nothing new. We've done this many times over the centuries and eons, and now we're doing it at an amazing rate. So here we see, when is this, 2017, fertile soil being lost at a rate of 24 billion tons a year. And this is mostly due to intensive agricultural practices, either small scale, but overly intensive, or large scale intensive agriculture. And Ratan Lal put out this very nice figure, which describes this death spiral that starts with extractive farming and ends with severe degradation of the soil, and then all sorts of unrest and unhappiness. And I just want you to notice that right up near the start comes depletion of soil organic carbon, which is synonymous with soil organic matter. And that's a huge part of it. And I mean, you all know why soil organic matter is so important. But anyway, so we know that depletion of soil organic matter is a key element of soil degradation. And so it follows that replenishment of soil organic matter is also a key element of soil restoration. And that's what I'll be talking about today, is some of the ways that we have discovered, or things we have discovered about soil organic matter formation that could be very useful in this important task. So you know all these things about soil organic matter, I'm pretty sure. Huge source of nutrients. Through its decomposition, it releases nutrients that the plants and the other organisms in the soil can use. It exchanges cations because it tends to have a negative charge. Holds loads of water. It's called the soil sponge. It supports soil life. So everything in the soil is there because they have a whole food web dependent on inputs of energy, especially containing compounds, as well as nutrients from the plants. And more we're thinking about how important a sink it is for carbon and the huge amounts of carbon that could potentially be sequestered in soil if we were managing it for that purpose, which is associated with a lot of other positive benefits. And so one more thing I want to mention about soil organic matter, just to remind you of, is that there's a vast array of different forms of soil organic matter. And the key is we need to get soil organic matter of all of these sorts back in the soil. And so not just quite labile or easily decomposed material like litter or humus, but also the more stable forms. And these are like the savings account that we need to have to rebuild in soils, in addition to the more labile forms, I guess our checking account. And so some of these forms can be in the soil for decades and centuries. And these are the ones that we really need to think about how we can get that back, because we have overdrawn that account in many places. So in terms of how we can replenish this, I mean, one of the most straightforward ways, and that can be done at least to kickstart the processes of bringing the soil back to life, are to add organic amendments. So that's an obvious way, and it has positive benefits. But a more long-lasting solution, I think, is for us to figure out how nature does it. How did all this soil organic matter in all these various forms come to be in soil and basically making soil what it is? And so we've been trying to figure out how nature does this. And because it's become such an important topic, there's just been an enormous amount of research on it in the last 20 years, I suppose. And it's really changed our thinking about soil organic matter. We might even call it a paradigm shift. It has changed so much in the last 10 years or so. And so that's what I wanted to talk to you about today, because I think it's so important that people who are actually managing land and soil know what we're thinking now about how this happens. And so I'd like to spend the first part of the talk just telling you what we've found out through a lot of investigations. And a lot of it's because we've got new techniques, which I don't fully understand, but the people using them understand. So I can present their findings without all the detail on all of that. And so this has been probably the major finding, and it started with a couple of soil scientists in Toronto who were looking at soil organic matter, and they found that it had a really large microbial signal. And so that's a signal coming from fungi and bacteria. And it's not a communication sort of signal. It's just when you're using nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, you get a signal for what it's from. And so they were finding most of it was actually coming from these microbes and not from plants. And so we'd always thought of a lot of organic matter in soil being essentially plant residues. And so they were the first ones who said, this is weird. We're finding all this microbial signal in here, and that wasn't expected at all. And then further research and in some really nice studies. I love electron microscopy or other types of microscopy because we can finally start to visualize some of this, which has always been the problem. You had to just kind of imagine it. And what they found was there's a whole lot of microbial residues, essentially the dead bodies of microbes. And here you can see the membrane or the envelope of a bacterial cell showing up here. And there's just like tons of them in the soil. And we used to think, well, bacteria, they're, here today, gone tomorrow. And they're so small and they'll decompose so quickly. But it turns out they don't. And their residues seem to be a really important source of even stable soil organic matter. So it seems to be about the microbes. And then we've also discovered how much of this stuff they produce, which we really didn't appreciate. And we know that this is especially what bacteria do. I mean, they produce all this stuff, this sticky stuff, and biofilms, and that's why they can form a film over just about anything that if you leave when it's moist and warm, you'll get a biofilm of some sort. And so let's take a closer look at this one. I thought this is just amazing. So here we have some fungal hyphae, so these big strands. Can you see my cursor?
Yeah, we can.
Good. So we got some fungal strands here, so fungal mycelia. And then we've got these guys are bacterial cells with the asterisks. And all this stuff is this biofilm produced by the bacteria that allows them to stick on, to hold in place. And great masses of this stuff are produced. And it seems to be a really important source of soil organic matter. Here's another one. You can see the red is the fungal hyphae. But all of these, and then we've got these little spots, which are the bacteria, and then all of this stuff, strings of stuff, kind of holding the bacteria in place. So just massive amounts of stuff. Here we have the bacterial biofilm in green, again, on the surface of a fungus. So, I mean, I guess we knew this was there, but we didn't know how abundant it was, and we didn't know that it would stick around. Little pun there. So this has been what it's called now. There's actually a paper referring to dead sticky microbes. They now seem to be the key to regenerating a lot of the soil organic matter. And so this shifts the emphasis quite a bit away from trying to produce plants that have a lot of lignin and other tough material to getting more of these microbes. So now the thinking is, if we want to regenerate soil organic matter in degraded soils, we actually have to feed the microbes. And so then the question becomes, okay, what do the microbes, especially the bacteria, it seems, like to eat? And I'll invite you to read this paper by Matt Wallenstein. It's freely available. It's a nice read, and it's in the Conversation, which is a great source of information. It's made palatable. So that, yes, so that the question is, what do these guys like to eat then? So how can we feed them? And here we found this other really kind of startling discovery that really a major source of energy for the microbes who then generate soil organic matter is the stuff that oozes out of roots, the root exudates. So plants release a lot of very simple high energy compounds out of their roots. And we've known this for a while. I mean, we know that the rhizosphere around roots is a very active area in terms of microbial biomass and activity. And we've got pictures such as this. This is a root of morning glory seedlings. And all of those things sitting on there, of course, are bacteria. And they're just sitting there living on all this nice energy rich stuff that plants just release into the soil, or just release into their roots and essentially straight into these microbes. And found some amazing photos here on the right. Number B, it's letter B. It's so root hairs extending out. So here's the root. You can see the root over here on the left. So they've just cut the soil and cut this root, and you can see like the vascular tissue in the middle and the epidermis around it. And then they follow some of these root hairs out, and they've observed this. And these are the root hairs, and they observe these globules, right? And this is stuff leaking out of the roots. So they're just exuding all of these nice compounds that can be used by the microbes. And although we've always sort of known this happens, we have not until recently appreciated the sheer amount of material that roots release into the environment. And this was a very recent study that really elegantly showed this, that inputs from these living roots are 2 to 13 times more efficient than litter inputs in forming both the slow cycling, more stable organic matter, as well as the more fast cycling. So they're all important sources of organic matter, but it seems like this material that comes out of roots is sort of mainlined into microbial biomass, microbial residues, and then more stable soil organic matter. So this really changes the story as to how we could regenerate soil organic matter, because it's not just about chucking some plant material in anymore. It's about kind of convincing the plants to pump more of this material into the soil, and that should get us more soil organic matter. And even if they're mycorrhizal, the same thing happens. So the mycorrhizal fungi are attached to the roots, and they take up this really nice high energy carbon material, and they transport it through their roots. But they also exude a lot of material, essentially anything that they may have in surplus or whatever, or waste. They will release into the environment. And this is a photograph of another one of fungal hyphae, and you can see all the bacteria just sitting there waiting and enjoying the feast. And so recently, these people were able to trace the movement of these materials, these photosynthates. So the plant photosynthesizes, produces all these nice high energy compounds, and then they were able to trace it down through the plant into the roots, into the mycorrhizal hyphae, and then out into the soil in those hyphae, and then straight out into the environment and into these bacteria sitting there waiting. So there's like a main line from plant leaf right into these soil bacteria, and from there into soil organic matter. And here's another nice cross section of a root, and you can see the root hairs then heading out into the soil. And I think this is a really nice chance to visualize and just imagine this, this pipeline that seems to exist between plants and soil microbes, with all of this coming out into the microbes, and then their death and turnover, as well as all the stuff that they release, then just generating soil organic matter. And so I think it's worth thinking about how that could help us to stimulate all of this activity, all this biological activity that will then result in soil organic matter increasing in degraded soils. So I'd like to pause there, if you don't mind, because I'm really interested in what this makes you think about as people who manage soil and manage essentially this whole ecosystem of plants and microbes, and are always trying to, I think, make that soil better. And what might be some of the implications for you of this information? And this may not be entirely new to you. You may have been thinking about this for a while, as there are other indications, many indications of it out there. But what does this suggest in terms of alternative management practices? Ah, Camille, that's excellent. Yes, I shudder to see those tarps, and I know why it's done. But I think one of the reasons that cover crops are so effective is that, well, now you can imagine if you're microbe down there on one of these root hairs, right? And suddenly there's like several months where there's just nothing coming in, right? You're not gonna, a lot of them are not going to be in that environment anymore. And it may be just a subset that are good at like hibernating and then coming back that come back. So probably the diversity, both the abundance and the diversity of these organisms will be so much smaller when they're tarped. Can I just ask about tarping? What is the rationale for tarping? Can somebody fill me in?
I think people do it because they think it covers, keeps the weeds down over the winter months. Is
Right.
what I assume from people in our community garden.
Right. So it's just to keep.
Yeah, I haven't seen a lot of people doing cover crops, and that's how I've built a lot of my soil.
By cover crops?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, first I used buckwheat and it didn't even grow the first year. And then the next year it was wonderful. And then I did the fall rye, and then now I've gotten busy and I never did properly take care of my plot for the last couple of years. The one year I put straw on, and then I found I had lots of horsetail. And so this year I just put leaves again, oak leaves. I heard oak leaves, our slugs don't like oak leaves, so I'm trying that, but we'll see.
Right, full of tannins probably is why.
Yeah, exactly. So that's my assumption.
Right, and prevents leaching, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If it prevents leaching, then it also prevents percolation, right? Infiltration. Yeah. So that won't be going down. Hey, Art, what are you thinking?
A couple things. First of all, that a lot of the crops that, particularly vegetable producers and possibly even Rachel in her flower production, a lot of these crops don't produce a lot of biomass. And so if there's cultivation involved, you're degrading the products of photosynthesis fairly readily. And so I think it really points to the need to try to keep something growing for as much of the year as you can to compensate for that. I guess the other thought is that these exudates are a cost to the plant, and I wonder how breeding for high yields have reduced the loss of carbon to exudates. Maybe we need to rethink breeding for these soil building crops so that we're producing more carbon that is exuded into the soil.
Absolutely. And that's what I'm going to talk about next, is how we can manipulate, instead of focusing on that above ground growth, to get a better balance with below ground growth. I wanted to mention that the cover crops. Now people say, well, that can't be important because they hardly grow, right? And that's not producing much biomass. But what this means is that what you're seeing above ground is a very small part of the story. As long as they are alive and photosynthesizing, it's actually good if they're not growing too much above ground, because that means they're putting more below ground. And it's not that stuff you can see that's building the soil, it's the stuff we can't see, apparently, that is feeding these microbes and building the soil organic matter. Oh, we've got, okay, tarps, get rid of the quack grass. Yeah.
Yeah. For the initial.
I guess we just have to think about what else it does.
Mhm.
Right? And if there's a better way to deal with that. And maybe once you get your soil organisms more active in that, then you won't have so much of that, that sort of thing. Because a lot of the stuff that we do think, okay, we don't have much soil organic matter, but that doesn't matter because we can throw on nitrogen, right? A lot of that just causes these other problems. Karen, you got your hand up.
Another, yeah, and because the plot that I got was really depleted. And I remember as a kid, my mother saying that when they're trying to dig up a new lawn or something to put a garden in or anything like that, they always just planted a field of potatoes or potatoes in that area. And I think it's because you're always having to hill the potatoes and everything that potatoes does for the soil, that eventually you'll get rid of the quack grass. So I don't know, dig a hole in and stick in potatoes, and then eventually your quack grass. And I'm going to try that this year with buttercup, because there's a lot of buttercup in our garden, and I can't spend my summer digging out buttercup, so this year I'm just piling manure on it and see if
and get some other things in there to make life a little more difficult for the buttercup. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I'd like to, since Art brought it up, I'd like to get on with this second part, because it's one that I've been closely involved in, and I think it's pretty exciting, not just because I've been closely involved in it. But yeah, so okay, if exudates are the key, then how do we get the plants to produce more exudates, which is a bit tricky. So what I've done is a lot of research. Oh, go ahead, Karen.
What are exudates? Did I miss it?
So this is that stuff that oozes out of the plants.
What you were just teaching us about. Yeah. Okay.
High energy, simple compounds that for some reason plants just pump out of their roots.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for my.
Okay. So I've been looking into a lot of the information that we have about the conditions under which plants release more root exudates, because of course that can then tell us what we could do in terms of creating the right conditions to get more of these. So this is what I found out after about a year's research, is that plants, and just about any plant that's being tested, including trees, they exude more carbon when their above ground growth is inhibited, but photosynthesis continues, and it may be at a reduced rate, but it continues such that the plant produces surplus photosynthate. And this is a curious phenomenon that arises simply because when a plant is facing a limitation, growth is shut off. So that's one of the first things that happens. Okay, no more growth, no more leaf growth. It shuts it off, but it doesn't stop photosynthesizing, which is very peculiar, but it's true. And part of the key to kind of figuring this out is accepting that plants and other organisms are not perfectly adapted. So even if it shouldn't happen, it does. And this is well established. And everybody knew this, just nobody really put it together. So what are these conditions? Well, they're very common conditions. They're like the conditions under which just about every plant exists. So they do it if they have inadequate nitrogen or phosphorus, not other nutrients. So if it doesn't have enough nitrogen, the plant will keep photosynthesizing, but it won't be able to grow because you need to have nitrogen to go into the compounds that allow for growth. If it doesn't have it, it still photosynthesizes, produces these high energy compounds, and then it recycles the nitrogen from them by shoving them into other pathways. So produces starch or produces a bunch of secondary compounds. And those are just ones that don't contain that limiting nutrient. So they basically do this really tight recycling of that nutrient and shove all this photosynthate out into the leaf or into the phloem, and then it goes down the plant. So they're just basically getting rid of this surplus photosynthate. The same thing happens with phosphorus. They recycle the inorganic phosphorus and send everything off as sucrose. So beautiful sugar, right? And down it goes. The same thing happens if they're water limited. They keep photosynthesizing to a point, right? At a certain point, it's going to create all sorts of problems. But with a small limitation, they keep photosynthesizing, but they stop growing. And the same with cold temperatures. And the very same thing happens when plants are fed surplus or excess carbon dioxide. So they produce more of this photosynthate, but they haven't got the stuff they need, the nitrogen usually, to grow. So there's all this surplus photosynthate. And it also happens with trees in the summer. At a certain point, they reach maximum leaf biomass, and then they stop producing more biomass. So at that point, they're using very little for growth. And what do we see? We see a huge flux of photosynthate down below ground. And this comes, with it comes root growth. This is when we see all the growth of the mycorrhizal fungi and the fruit. And it's all related to the plant not having above ground sink for all this photosynthate. And so all of these result in more being sent below ground. I'm going to pause there to find out if you have any questions about that, because it's very peculiar, and it's been well demonstrated, but the plant physiologists for some reason cannot cope with this fact because it doesn't fit with their mindset about plants being somehow perfectly adapted and this is just efficient. And they're so used to thinking about photosynthate and carbon being the limiting factor. They cannot think about plants actually having a surplus of that, which I always thought was odd, because if you want a plant to grow more, do you give it more CO2? No, you give it nutrients, you give it water, right? And then they grow more. So why do they think that this carbon is limiting? It's just very strange. And that they've persisted in this belief despite the evidence that's come up that they often have surplus carbon. And so we finally wrote this up last year and got it published and caused a bit of a stir. But it's simply true, and it's so important because this is the mechanism by which we, especially you, people who are actually doing this, can get more of this material down building soil.
Cindy, I'm not sure if you saw there's a comment from Cal.
Yeah, I'm just looking at that.
Okay,
So,
yeah.
yes. So drought has been shown to increase root exudation. Several times very clearly. And people have come up with all sorts of, how this is in order to allow it to get more water or something, It's just because the plant cannot grow any more above ground. That sink is removed and it's still photosynthesizing. So down it goes. So yeah, a little bit of drought is good. A lot of drought, problematic, right? Because you don't want to kill the plant or have it so that I'm not sure at what point photosynthesis shuts down. I'm told it cannot actually shut down without creating damage. So if it's that droughted, then your plant's going to die. Yeah, so a little drought, not such a problem. It's probably a good thing below ground. All right. So this is what I've been thinking about. How can we encourage this? And we usually think about this. Now, this is what I teach in forest nutrition, that if you want maximum growth without wasting fertilizer, then you look for this point and you add nutrients to the point where that nutrient no longer limits growth. And this always means above ground growth. And this is the key, because we always think about above ground growth and we never think about below ground. So this is what we usually do, is figure out what nutrient addition or what foliar leaf concentration will create maximum growth above ground of the plant. Same for water. And then we add that much because we don't want to waste it. But what I think now is that what we need to find is this place that is actually optimal, in that we can get good growth above ground and we can also have some of that good stuff going below ground and building the soil. So if we're maximizing above ground growth, what we're probably doing is starving the soil. And so this whole mindset about maximizing what you can see above ground is coming at a cost. And that cost is the degradation of the soil. And this is the same in forest ecosystems as agricultural ecosystems. This is what our laser focus on above ground growth is getting us. And so I think the same applies for water as well. That if we irrigate it to maximize above ground growth, we're reducing below ground flux. So what I want to do now, or what I want other people to do, is start identifying this sweet spot where we can manage the availability of these resources so that maybe we're not getting the maximum possible above ground growth, but we're getting the optimum balance of above ground growth and soil organic matter generation. So I think the key to regenerating soil organic matter is to maintain plants under conditions in which they generate surplus photosynthate and release it from their roots and feed the microbes who then generate the soil organic matter. So the key to growing crops without degrading soil is to consider both the above ground yield and the carbon fluxes to the below ground component. So it's a bit of a trade-off, but I think it's worthwhile. So stop focusing solely on above ground yield. And this is all you ever hear about with agriculture, and the same in forestry, if it's intensive forestry, how to maximize that above ground yield. And instead figure out how we can optimize both above ground and below ground production. And the below ground biomass of plants is often equivalent to the above ground biomass if they're growing under, or more, if they're growing under appropriate conditions. It's often much less if we're fertilizing the heck out of them. And this also optimizes, it doesn't maximize, it optimizes or provides some of this flux from the plant to feed the soil biota. And that's what's going to bring your soil back to life. Because this is the fuel for the whole below ground ecosystem. So if you can get this working, then these microbes are not only generating soil organic matter, they are generating the food base for the entire ecosystem down there. And it's been shown that different plants also release different exudates, and they release different kinds of exudates under different conditions. So if you increase the diversity of your above ground, of your plants, then you can also increase the diversity of the below ground ecosystem. And a large part of that effect, and one of the experiments showed that the entire effect was attributed to this exudate cocktail, that if you have a whole bunch of interesting stuff in those exudates, then you get a whole bunch of different microbes. And so it's the mechanism by which plant diversity generates soil microbe diversity. So you can increase the abundance and you can increase the diversity. So I'm going to stop nattering at this point and take your thoughts, your questions, and then I confess I have some questions for you, because I'm really interested in your thoughts on this, as well as how you could see this perhaps being used to adapt practices. So first, any questions about any of this? Oh, here's some.
Yeah, I think there were two questions that came up in the chat.
Right, yes. So Catherine, I think that's a good way to put it. A little tough love. Like, I'm not going to make life perfect for you. You're going to have to make it without everything handed to you. And that will also encourage you to share a bit. There's a nice analogy. I like that. How do we measure this sweet spot? I don't know. All I know is it will be less than the maximum, or what is now called the optimum amount of, say, fertilizer to add. And I hope that's going to be the next thing that we start thinking about. Weed buddies. I think you should encourage buddies. Definitely, especially if those buddies fix or have nitrogen fixing associates. Because a really cool thing about legumes is that they are They have high rates of photosynthesis because they have a lot of nitrogen, but they actually have surplus nitrogen and carbon. They tend to be phosphorus limited. And so if you collect exudates from legumes, you'll find a load of nitrogen in it. And this is so important because microbes contain a lot of nitrogen. And so if you're releasing all this carbon, it would be really nice for them to have some nitrogen. But if you just throw it on the surface, like they're all sitting on the roots and you're throwing it on the surface, like, you know, get it coming out of the roots. And that's what legumes do. And there's an amazing correlation between the number of nitrogen fixing plants with nitrogen fixing root associates, and the amount of soil organic matter, whether it's forests or agricultural systems. If you have species that fix nitrogen, you have more soil organic matter. And I think this is part of the reason we've been looking at other places for the reason, but I think this is it. That will also provide those microbes sitting down on the roots with all this nice nitrogen, these amino compounds, all sorts of stuff. And that generates microbial biomass because, you know, they have a CN ratio less than 10. So very nitrogen demanding. And much of the soil organic matter, especially the more stable forms, shows indicators for amino sugars, which are produced by bacteria. And so, you know, it's like a main line. Label or high energy carbon with nitrogen into the microbes, boom, into soil organic matter. There's so much evidence for that. So those are the buddies that I would suggest you incorporate. If pruning above ground growth will affect exudate, that's a fantastic question. Because now I've only been looking at grass because I'm really interested in this regenerative grazing effect. And actually, maybe I'll take a little side trip to talk about that. So just bear with me. So yeah, so here's what happens with grass, right? And so you have this, if it's grazed down, then it starts to grow back. And so thinking about this from a surplus carbon perspective, none, because you don't have much leaf, right? So you don't have much photosynthesis. Starting to come back, but all of that photosynthesis is probably being used for above ground growth. So while that plant is really actively growing above ground, and I think there's a point here where it becomes surplus, right? So now it's got so much biomass producing so much photosynthesis that it's, especially if it's not fertilized and it gets dry, then all of this part, I think up here, is when it's generating surplus. And that would be part of the reason why you get those incredible root systems under grasses and why they are so darn good at creating soil organic matter. And we found in our restoration reclamation studies, under grasses, you get soil organic matter generated much faster than you do under trees. So I don't know why we think, oh, get some trees on it, everything will be fine. Get some grass on it and don't give it too much love, right? Be a little tough with the water and the nutrients, and it's going to produce a whole lot of surplus. So it depends. If we are creating pruning with this, I would say it depends where it is in the growth phase. So if you cut it back here, it's going to have a negative effect because it's not into that surplus stage. Whereas if you graze it up here, then it's had all of this time to just pump all that stuff below ground. Now, Camille, were you thinking, what kind of plants were you thinking about with pruning?
I was thinking about like, I think I was thinking more about like cover crops and things like that. So like if we cut them down and there's already this epic root system that has grown kind of like, you know, as the plant matures, there's this big root system. If you cut down part of the green, how does that affect the roots? Do the roots die back? And yeah, I was just wondering if that like kind of interrupts the cycle and creates a surplus, or that
It's
kind of
interesting
thing.
because, you know, there's this evidence from the farmer managed natural regeneration, if you've heard about that in Africa, that if you have an established root system and you prune the plant, I mean, let it grow a bit and then prune it well, just grows like stink. And so I think if it does that, then again, at a certain point, it's going to have so much leaf biomass that it's going to be able to share that, especially if it's not fertilized or irrigated, which they usually aren't, right? They're just out there in these dreadful soils. So I think it will stimulate that because you've got to get enough leaf biomass that you've got a serious source of material, and it's got to keep photosynthesizing. But you also want it to kind of slow down with the above ground production. And then it would shift. And I think that's why FMNR, farmer managed natural regeneration, is so successful.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also the pruning effect or the grazing effect, this invigoration, right? And so there's this invigoration of photosynthesis and of growth and just this, more vigorous. And so I've seen this, I decided I was going to, got some property, so decided I was going to let the lawns convert and then get a meadow, right? And so I've witnessed what happens when you do that. And so I got really nice growth, lovely, lovely. And then it just becomes tough and nothing's going to eat it. And so I saw this and then I thought, what I'm also doing is starving the below ground. So they're not going to be regenerating many roots because I'm not encouraging them to send their photosynthate below ground. So now what I need are some cows to come in and eat them at about this point.
Yeah. Like if you think about like just natural pruning, like the bears trotting through the forest when they're naturally pruning the dead branches off of the bushes so that all of the energy can be focused specifically on the trees so that it just actually comes back more vigorously, even though it seems like it's been disturbed. That disturbance is actually like encouraging the regeneration as part of the cycle.
And we do see that with trees, that you can get more vigorous growth. And the thing is, we don't usually know why, we just, you see, you do it and something happens and then all the rest is like, like the grazing thing. Oh, it must be the dung in the urine. It must be the residue. It must be the trampling. I think it must be the surplus carbon going below ground. It's trouble with, we've got the practices and they work and we don't really know why.
Yeah.
So less about competition in the garden, more about diversity companions. Yes, I mean, not everyone's going to get along, right? And you may not see the benefit, like with the legumes, you might not see the benefit if your response variable that you're measuring is simply the yield of your crop, right? You've got to allow that might not be maximized under these, but what will be optimized is that union of plant and soil that is creating a very functional ecosystem that's probably growing those crops at the rate that it should. Right. Good question. How can we assess below ground growth without pulling out the plant? Yeah, that tends to be problematic for plants. I don't know. Any ideas? I think we would have to do this in experiments where you simply have to do it. So I think these principles or these suggestions need to be worked out experimentally. And actually, I have a colleague at the Rodale Institute that is working on this with me, and they're going to start trying to quantify these relationships. I mean, at what point along this curve, the sweet spot, where is that sweet spot, and how do you know? So yeah, I don't think you can unless you want to sacrifice some of your plants. So Georgia, what's your question about soil sampling? Can you?
I guess I was wondering if, like, considering you were talking about how inadequate nutrients are, like, yeah, this happens, like the below ground growth takes place partly when there are inadequate nutrients. Could measuring nutrients be a way of understanding whether you're reaching that target or not?
Maybe plant nutrients. Maybe the concentration in the plant would give you the best indicator.
Okay.
And of course, that's what we use in forestry, because the soil doesn't tell us. The trick to that is what really matters is the availability of nutrients around those roots and hyphae, right? Because that's where these guys are. And that's why I think the best way to deal with that is to get the nitrogen and other nutrients that you might want to add coming down in the plant. And that's kind of tricky because, well, what would work if you got extra nitrogen in the plant, but not phosphorus, so it was imbalanced, then that would all be used for growth. What do you think?
I don't know.
Yeah, I went out on a limb and then realized I couldn't go any farther and I couldn't get back.
Maybe art. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think, Art?
Well, I think what tends to drive this is in most of our local soils here, where we're anything that's growing agricultural type crops are well supplied with most nutrients, and the key is nitrogen, I think, and how that maybe continues to drive vegetative growth and leaf development and so on. And so it might be possible to do some soil sampling for that nutrient, for the nitrate, for example, during the summertime, and get a sense of whether we've overdone it. We're really sort of still encouraging above ground growth, as opposed to what Cindy wants is to see that settle down and see more photosynthates going down to the root system. So that would be one thought. But can I go back to an earlier question about weeds? And again, for people who are growing crops that are susceptible to certain weeds, we really need to look at when weed competition is an issue for the crop that you're growing, where you can't, you stand a chance of losing your crop because the weeds get away on you, as opposed to later on in the season when the crop is well established and you can stand some weed growth as an understory and get that biodiversity in exudates that Cindy so wants to see. And I think this also applies to cover cropping. And as you know, we've been engaged in this with SPEC for some time. Perhaps we need to get into the game a bit earlier and look at that late season sort of window when we've got solar radiation hitting the Earth's surface. We could capture some of that in an early established cover crop within a crop canopy and get a head start on the winter. And that's something we've been remiss on in our program, but maybe that's something to think about in terms of adding that variety of plants, weeds, cover crop, diverse cover crop understory, and then using the cool shoulders of the growing season, fall and spring, to really ramp up carbon production, some of which would benefit root organisms and soil microorganisms.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. And yeah, have them, so you have it continuous. There's not this abrupt removal of the plants. You've got other ones coming in.
Kind of a
And maybe
relay.
if you do that through the winter, and then you have your main crops in the summer, then that's sufficient. You don't need to have, you've got something coming in all the time, especially if you've got, especially if you've got legumes in your cover crops, then you've got nitrogen coming in all winter.
But you realize what you're doing. You're complicating management. And the easiest thing is a very simple crop, high yielding, use the herbicides and all this sort of thing. And now we're talking about some kind of ecological system, and it complicates things dramatically. I think it's very rewarding when it works. And every farm, every crop rotation is different. And so this is something that sort of, it's almost an art to it. There is the science, but there's also the art. What works in your cropping system for your products on your farm, your soils, your climate.
And I think, I think there's enough going on in terms of people saying that we need to be thinking about this differently now that, it's there. The desire to shift is there. Even Joe Biden's now a believer in cover crops.
Yeah.
So Jenny, would it be beneficial to leave a plant in the soil after it ceased to be productive? Well, either way, leaving the roots is definitely a good idea. I used to be a firm believer in the above ground litter. And again, that depends on your purpose, and it also depends if it's going to cause problems. I know at the Rodale, they've invented this roller crimper, so you can kill off your cover crop without having to till or add herbicide. So yeah, a lot of good reasons to leave that residue. So why do you usually take the residue out if you do? There must be reasons if you take it out. That sounds like a bit of work to me. Anybody know?
Jenny says to make room for new crops.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I wonder about that because I know with my raspberries, I read that I should take the old canes right out because they'll grow fungus on them. But then I thought, what's wrong with that? So I have the same question actually, because that should be a nice source of soil organic matter and also insect habitat, which may not be what you want either. Okay, goats. Is this for the pruning? Yeah.
Yes, for the pruning.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. And you just manage when you put them in there according to the growth stage of your grass and such. Yeah, I think it all depends on the timing. As of course we know. No dig. Well, let's think about no dig. Let's think about digging. So you've got your plants and that plant is only important when it's alive and sending photosynthate down. And once it's dead, I mean, there's a little pulse while all this stuff is released as the tissue breaks down. But then really it's really at that point, it's up to the decomposer fungi to break it down. So I'm not, with the no dig, is that like with live plants or dead plants or what? At what point would you be digging?
I guess I'm assuming it's maybe something like, oh, plant seedlings into holes. And I'm assuming no dig would be a type of no, or could be no till.
Yeah.
Yeah. The thing about, yeah, so while the plant is alive, you can now picture all those roots and then root hairs coming out. So you wouldn't want to cut that while the plant's alive. Once it's dead, then shouldn't matter. Karen, you had something to say about that?
Yeah, well, the no dig, I'm curious about that too, because now people in the garden, it's the Strathcona garden, so it's a pretty big area. There's a lot of different gardeners, and some of them are tilling the garden and others are not, because they say tilling now is no good because I guess it's just disruptive, like she says, killing the bacteria and what's at work already. And then others do. So is that maybe like the no dig? That's
right. So that it depends if you've got perennials or annuals. So if you got perennials, yes, that would be disruptive. But then it would generate more probably. Yeah. What are you thinking, Art?
Couple of thoughts. The first thing is that some plant above ground tissue needs to be just destroyed because it can provide a host or a habitat for disease or insect pests. And the brassicas would be probably a big example, but there could be others as well, where you want to get rid of the above ground potential green bridge from one season to another. And so that would be one area, but usually it's a matter of controlling the above ground growth and stopping that in its tracks rather than totally removing everything. I guess the second thought about no dig or no till is that your ability to do that depends a lot on the crops that you're trying to grow. And if you've got any root crops in there, there's no way you can have a no-till system. Every time a root crop comes in, you're going to have to dig that crop. Therefore, you have tillage. And even no-till seeding of crops that are suited to that probably have almost maybe 25% or a third of the soil disturbed at the surface anyway for seeding purposes. But what we should be thinking about is minimizing tillage, and ask the question every time we're getting ready to dig into that soil, is this operation necessary? Because there's a cost to it. And that there's a cost in energy, either human or fossil fuel energy. There's a cost to soil organic matter. There's a cost to soil structure. And so there should be a damn good reason before you till. And we see a lot of that here in this humid coastal climate, a lot of tillage that you would not see in other regions, I think. So there's a bit of a mindset here that we need to work against, but it's about minimum tillage and questioning every tillage operation, I think.
It also brings up the matter of pores, because that's another thing I didn't mention because it wasn't directly related, is that for soil organic matter with these bacteria, what they found, they did, how did they do? They cut the soil and did kind of like thin sections. And what they found was the organic matter in the soil was really strongly related to the pore, especially pores of a certain size. And so those pore surfaces, like around the pore, are real hotbeds for these bacteria. They create their biofilm, they just live there, right? And we sort of knew that. But what we didn't know was that then becomes a real hotspot of soil organic matter formation. And so you've got this established community on these pores doing all sorts of stuff and creating all sorts of organic matter. And that's all kind of permeating in the surface, the walls of the pore, and going in from there. And so there may be a cost to disrupting those pores through tillage, because then it's like, okay, now we got all these new surfaces, let's get going here. They got to get there and they got to really get going. So that might be part of it too. I mean, you create all the things that you thought porosity was about, which is air and moisture movement and all that, but you disrupt all those microbes that were living in that pore. So that may be one of the, and this paper just came out last year, so I don't think there's been much discussion about how that applies yet to agriculture, but it could be a big reason why tilling results in such a reduction in soil organic matter. Well, that was something to chew on, that one, definitely. So Catherine, too much oxidation. Now you're talking about tilling here? Yeah, the mycelia, again, if they're, it's most of these systems would have arbuscular mycorrhizae that do not have these really long, extensive hyphae. I mean, they have hyphae coming out from the root hairs, but so it's not quite the sort of system that we get in forests. But yes, disruption of that. Yeah, cutting through fungi. And yes, if your cover crops can become mulch, so it just depends on whether that addition of organic matter and like the fuel and the nutrients in it are sufficiently positive that they outweigh any potential worries about insects and fungi. And again, most of my experience with this sort of thing is in forests where we don't have to worry about all those things. So a little bit different in agricultural systems. The matrix, yeah. The soil has a real matrix to it, and a lot of this is about the pores. And so especially with, thinking about this recent finding about how important pores are for organic matter, that makes me think a lot more about pores, actually. So they do more than just allow the water to go through and the air to get in. They're a real habitat.
So I'm just doing a quick time check. It's 11:24, and I think some people will have to leave at 11:30, but I think Cindy, you can can you stick around longer to answer other questions?
I can, yeah. This has given me a lot to think about. Let's see. Right, so I also had some questions for you, if some of you can stay. I think we've probably already covered number 1, and I think we've already pretty much touched on number 2. But yeah, any other ways you might be able to modify your usual practices so that you could increase root exudation? So cover crops, earlier planting of cover crops, including legumes, maybe leaving them. Did you say also leaving them later, Art?
It would kind of depend on the crop that you want to follow with. And so that's usually this time of the year you're starting to think about that. And so for early crops, you're going to be terminating the cover crop now. For ones that are heat loving and you're going to be planting in May, then it would be a good idea to leave the cover crop as long in April as you can because that's when a lot of the above ground biomass and nitrogen fixation occurs, and obviously supporting the below ground roots and root exudates would occur. So April is a critical month if you can afford it. And so it brings up another point about crop rotation. And there are certain things you can do at some points in the rotation that you can't do in the others. And so establishment of early fall cover crops won't work in a potato or carrot or something where you're going to be digging probably. But it would work under other brassicas and so on, where you could start early. And then to come the next spring, what's the crop that's coming in? If it's an early one, you'll terminate the cover crop early. If it's late, you can leave it in. And the final thing that I would say is that as you mentioned, the Rodale Institute has been for some time working on cutting and crimping cover crops so that you get good control and good mulching. And I think there's definitely some potential there. The one thing I would point out, and we learned this during Dr. Kurzich's PhD research, was that having mulch on a field for too long can encourage pests like slugs. And we had real issues with slugs moving in where there was a lack of disturbance for more than 1 year. So this is another thing that comes up when we're looking at tillage requirement and disturbance requirement.
There's something interesting about slugs that I'd like to know more about. I was, during my lawn conversion, I was also digging out all the weeds. And because I wanted to leave the nutrients in organic matter, because some of the soils are very poor, I would just drop them and leave them there. And within hours, the slugs were on them. So they weren't eating them when they're alive, but within hours. So there must be some sort of smell or something that tells them that this plant no longer has defenses or something. I thought that was astonishing. So, I mean, if plants or slugs are that good, yeah, then you're leaving that residue will definitely attract them. I'd like to know how they do that, how they sense that suddenly that plant is now available for eating. I just thought it was strange.
There's another study.
Yeah, so I said, put them out. Maybe I can use it to attract them to places away from the garden. It's like, here, have a bunch of dandelion, not dandelion, other weeds.
Yeah, get them away from the lettuce.
Yeah.
Like, give them to the buttercups.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, slugs. Yeah. Into the dog's food. Oh, they'd love that, wouldn't they? Yeah, I found one in my boot when I put it on one morning. What are you doing in there? They feel really interesting. They're very cold. I had bare feet too. Okay. Does leaving plants to winter kill increase fruit exudation? So you mean leaving your crop and letting it die? Yes. That might work. Yeah, because one of my colleagues wrote the paper with me, has done work in mountain ecosystems. And that's one of the things he found was that at a certain, as the temperature cools, more and more of the photosynthate goes below ground. That might work, yeah. So they're probably doing, if it gets a bit dry in the summer, and then when it gets cold, and so I expect cover crops that can never put on too much above ground biomass because the cold are probably putting a lot below ground. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, let them finish off before you get rid of them. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, Karen. You're still muted, Karen.
Oh, sorry. I'm astonished at how brilliant my mother was.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, because she did all of that. And I think they were farmers back there. And I think so that's what they just intuitively did, I guess.
Yep, they knew what worked.
Yeah, and then in the spring they would kind of clean it up. And my father was big on tilling, and there was a lot of conflict between, well, not big conflict, but Dad had one opinion, she had another, and usually Mom won because it was her kind of thing. But yeah, Dad did do some tilling though, but just not with the rototiller unless it was the acreage. But my question too, I don't know if anybody wants to hear this or if you're going to stay later, maybe I'll wait till everybody's gone and then because for art too, it's about big farms in Alberta and how they can stop using the fertilizers and do more of an organic. But they're doing thousands of acres, so their system is well set, and I don't know how to maybe have them at least think about something different.
Yeah, the thing about this is that it isn't all or nothing. It's saying what we need to do is manage the plant nutrition a bit differently. And so I would love to see research on it under these situations where if we just tweaked it so we didn't, so again, you could manage, if you took the plant tissue and analyzed it, you could work out where that sweet spot is that will give you good growth, but still allow for a lot of flux below ground.
Because of course we go with the combines and everything comes down and then they receive.
But I think the main problem is adding so much fertilizer that you're essentially starved the below ground, because we've been thinking, for so long, the soil was just like that substrate into which you add the nutrients that are necessary. But thinking of it as an ecosystem now, I think it is bringing about a change in how we think about it and how we might manage it.
Yeah, I'll have to. Can I send them this? Oops.
Yes.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I think in terms of Alberta, but also just fertilizer use on large scale farms, there is a movement and has been lots of research around, I'm forgetting the name, but I'll include it in my email too if I remember. Art probably knows, but it's just like efficient, I think it's efficient use of nitrogen fertilizer, essentially. And it's very possible to reduce the use of nitrogen fertilizer, but often it requires, I think, just technology and close monitoring. So that is part of the limitations, from what I understand, that not all farmers don't have access to the types of sort of tools and resources that they need to apply.
So it'll tell you which part of your field needs it.
Yeah, to apply fertilizer at the optimal level, which is a good thing for farmers because it reduces costs, and it does, it's in the long term better.
So I would say do that, yeah, and then add a bit less of at least one of them, nitrogen or phosphorus. The other ones, the problem is if you reduce potassium, it shuts down the phloem loading, so it's not the photosynthase aren't shipped out. It's only nitrogen and phosphorus that keep that active and lead to that. So I would say, yeah, with either nitrogen or phosphorus, figure out how much you would usually add and add a bit less. But we need the research to figure out how much less would optimize the two.
Right. I guess the other thing that I thought of, because for my research at UBC, I've been looking at soil organic carbon, like building soil organic carbon in agricultural soils to potentially be part of a climate change mitigation strategy. But one thing I learned is just that there's been huge shifts in the adoption of cover cropping and reducing summer fallow. And a lot of it's taken place in Alberta. So there have been huge kind of improvements, and that's been sort of thought of as one of the main reasons why our soil organic carbon has kind of increased and plateaued in agriculture in Canada, is because that adoption has increased a lot on the prairies.
Right,
So that's a good news story.
right. And again, that plateau, I mean, that's as high as you can get by changing that one thing. So what's the next thing that you could change?
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting.
Any thoughts, Art?
Not sure I have much to add to that. In Canada, of course, we're dominated by the prairie provinces in terms of soil carbon losses and sequestering and so on. And it's um, way more complex in the sort of systems that we're dealing with here in coastal, in British Columbia in general. And they're small scale. We don't tend to have the good research support that you would have in more extensive systems. And, you know, a lot of our farmers maybe have 20 different crops instead of 2 or 3 or 4 that have to be managed. So precision is, I think, more difficult here.
That's the
And,
word.
you know, I think that's you know, that's a challenge for us. We just have to do the best we can. The thing we have going for us, though, is that cool, moist conditions here at the coast, at least, tend to favor sequestering organic matter. So it takes less to store organic matter here than it does out in areas where it's hotter and drier.
So Catherine, you had a question about periodic grazing timed. Can you clarify what you're thinking of there? Are you thinking about like adaptive multi-paddock grazing? Or just have some livestock graze your, oh, I see, to increase the grassland exudates. That's interesting. Yeah, certainly in grasslands, totally works. I'm convinced this is why mob grazing, rotational grazing works, because it's perfectly aligned with the lifestyle of grasses. And yeah, and so if you wait to graze until late phase 2 and then don't cut them back too far, then they spend much of their time, the grasses spend much of their time in a state of surplus carbon. And so you would totally build soil organic matter if you did that. And there's so much evidence coming out now that they don't know why, but it really seems to work. And of course, like anything, it'll work under some conditions and it won't work so well under other conditions. And that will probably depend on the extent to which the growth of the plant is limited by nutrients or moisture, because those have to come in as well. So if you fertilize it and then graze it, you probably won't get anywhere near the effect. You'll think it's fantastic because you got, wow, look at all this green grass, but you won't get the soil development. Yeah, I actually did have a slide about regenerative agriculture because it's one of the things we're working on right now, is just how closely this fits with the way we were thinking through. Well, okay, so what does all this mean in terms of promoting soil organic matter formation, and you need to do all of these things. And all of these things will tend to promote soil organic matter. And then if you look at each one, it's dead easy to see, geez, that's essentially what you do. Sorry about the green, this is not working at all, but this is essentially what you do with a lot of these regenerative practices. So this might be at least part of the explanation why these work.
Thank you. This is really, this slide is very helpful. Yeah, and I guess unless there's other questions, we can wrap up, or unless you have final thoughts you want to share, Cindy.
No, I appreciate it. I've been given lots to think about. It's been very helpful for me.
Yeah, I think it was really neat to bring together the two worlds of restoring degraded soils and agriculture and art. It was really helpful to have you here too, because you have so much experience working directly with farmers. But hopefully, yeah, it gave people lots to think about. And we'll send out a recording of Cindy's session. Also I'll send out some links to some of the papers that Cindy mentioned in her talk. And feel free to email me if you have any kind of questions that pop up later. And I also just wanted to mention again that if you have any ideas for additional talks or sessions that you'd like me to organize, then please reach out, and we might be able to make it happen. I know it's getting close to the busy season for all of you, but I'm here as a resource to support your learning and sharing resources that are helpful to you. So thank you so much, Cindy and Art and everyone, for coming and joining us today. And please, I would love it if you could complete the evaluation form. I've been pestering you. I'll put it in the chat again, but it's really helpful for us to see, and also just helps me record any ideas for future events. But thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who participated in the 2021 Small Farm Sessions.
I should just say, I forgot to put my email address on, but my email address is just cindy.prescott@ubc.ca. If you have any thoughts, just feel free to contact me.
Okay, great. I'll put it in the email too.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and week. And hopefully we'll be in touch soon. Bye-bye.
Bye, Georgia. Thanks again.
Bye, Julian.
And thanks very much, Cindy.
Thank you. That was wonderful.